Welcome to your first grammar lesson for the IELTS speaking section of this course. Today we are going to focus on three main types of sentence structures that you can easily learn and use to score a higher band score in the IELTS speaking test. Now, before we move on, I understand that for many students grammar is a big worry. But there really isn't any need to be really worried about it. It's true that you do not have to be 100% accurate to get a good score in the IELTS test. It is expected that you may make some small mistakes, so relax and have confidence in your speaking skills. Let's return to the band descriptors to help us to understand why those three main types of sentence structures can be very helpful. Again, if we take a look at the 7-band score, it simply says use a range of complex structures flexibly. An easier way to understand what complex structures is to think of it as just adding a lot more detail into your sentences when you are speaking. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean using lots of adjectives, but adding extra pieces of information, and that's what you will learn in this lesson. To help you understand what complex structures are, here are a few examples, and it is around the topic of transportation. Let's take a look at the first example. The ferry leaves at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning. I hope we can make it. Now, there are two simple sentences in this speaking part. A simple sentence is a sentence that only has one main point of information. The ferry leaves at 10:30 tomorrow morning is one piece of information. I hope we make it. That's another piece of information. So we can see that they are simple sentences. Let's take a look at more of a complex structure. The ferry leaves at 10:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, which is earlier than usual. I hope we can make it, although I'm not sure we will. Now, it's quite easy to see that there is more detail in this example, and you should be trying to do this quite often in the IELTS speaking test. I've highlighted the part which is earlier than usual, and that is another piece of information. So that sentence now has two pieces of information. I hope we can make it, although I'm not sure we will. I used a connective and an extra part of the sentence, I'm not sure we will, to add some extra detail. This is a great example of a complex structure. So there we have some examples to highlight the differences between simple and complex structures. Now let's take a look at the three main sentence types that you should be using in the IELTS speaking test. We have a simple sentence, a compound sentence, and a complex sentence. A simple sentence has one clause. Now I should explain what a clause is, and quite simply a clause is one piece of information. So we can see that in this example, a simple sentence has one clause. There is only one clause there. So what about compound sentences? A compound sentence has two clauses and adds more detail. I've highlighted the two clauses in this sentence. Now let's take a look at a complex sentence. A complex sentence has an independent and dependent clause, which doesn't make sense on its own. I might say that making complex sentences is the more challenging of the three sentence types. In red, I've highlighted which doesn't make sense on its own. Now, on its own, that part of the sentence, you wouldn't really understand what the point is. But when the red part is added to the blue part, or the dependent clause to the independent clause, it does make sense. A complex sentence has an independent and dependent clause, which doesn't make sense on its own. I'll show you some more examples later on in this video. So let's take a look at some examples for simple sentences. A simple sentence has one clause, and I'll show you examples on the topic of travel. I love travelling to Spain. Christmas is my favourite time to travel. The plane tickets are very cheap today. Try and visit me in your vacation. These are all examples of simple sentences where there is only one clause or one main piece of information. Let's move on to compound sentences. A compound sentence has two clauses and adds more detail. Now you may have noticed that I've underlined and. And is a connective, and a compound sentence will always use a connective. I'll show you some examples around the topic of food. Cooking is a real passion of mine, but I'm not sure my food always tastes great. It's probably also worth noting that in compound sentences, there are two independent clauses. Instead of the connective, if you simply add a full stop, it would still make sense. It would actually turn them into simple sentences without the connective. Let's see another example. The food in India is so delicious because they have a strong food culture. British food can be quite bland, although English pies are very filling and warming. I'm not an adventurous eater really, and I usually enjoy eating familiar foods. So that's all for compound sentences. Remember to use a connective to join those two simple sentences together. Now let's take a bit of a further look at complex sentences. So a complex sentence has an independent and dependent clause, which doesn't make sense on its own. Let's see an example now around the topic of money and finance. At the end of the month, I often try and save some money. At the end of the month is a dependent clause. It needs the independent clause to make sense. Let's take a look at a second example. Hopefully one day I'll be rich, but maybe it's just a dream. And again, the dependent clause is in red. But maybe it's just a dream. Does that make sense on its own? As it's the dependent clause, it doesn't make sense and it is not a full sentence without the independent clause. So there we have the three sentence types that you should be using in the IELTS speaking test. It's important to note that you should use all three types as well. If you were only to use compound sentences for the whole test, you would score lower marks. As a practice activity, go to the Q&A section and try writing all three main types of sentence structures. If you see some other students' responses, remember to give them some feedback. Now we'll move on to another grammar lesson for IELTS speaking. See you there.